What happened when an undercover CEO walked into his own stadium and saw a loyal groundskeeper humiliated over a birthday cake? You're about to find out, and trust me, you won't forget it. Hello, dear listeners. You have amazing taste for tuning in today, because this story is packed with heart, justice, and a twist that'll give you goosebumps. Sometimes one quiet man, one kind woman, and one small cake can shake an entire system. Stay with us, because what starts as a firing ends as a legacy, and the man everyone ignored becomes the hero no one can stop talking about. The rain had been falling for hours, soaking every corner of Hartman Field and turning the empty stadium into a symphony of drips and echoes. Elena Torres moved through the dimly lit concourse, the scent of stale popcorn and wet concrete clinging to the air. It was the off-season, and most of the stadium was shut down, except for a few maintenance lights and the distant hum of old security cameras. She was finishing her shift at the concession stand, just some end-of-season cleanup really, when she spotted him again, Walt Kinney. He sat alone on the edge of the dugout bench, soaked through, shoulders hunched beneath his faded army jacket. For weeks now, he'd been quietly raking the outfield, oiling squeaky gates and sweeping corners no one noticed. He rarely spoke, never asked for help, and always vanished before sunrise. Tonight, though, something felt different. Alina, a former EMT now studying physical therapy at night, had developed a soft spot for the old groundskeeper. As she passed by with a mop in hand, she caught the low rasp of his voice. 71 today. Doesn't matter. Nobody remembers. The words stopped her in her tracks. She backed away without a word, heart pounding, not from fear, but from something else. Guilt, empathy, urgency. 15 minutes later, Elena stood in the shuttered stadium kitchen, pulling ingredients from the leftovers cart. Unsold hot dog buns, baking mix, half a carton of eggs. The place smelled like fryer grease and mildew, but to her it felt like a mission. Within 20 minutes, she had shaped a lopsided birthday cake and stuck a single candle she'd found in the lost and found drawer on top. With the stadium quiet around her, she carried it through the rain to the dugout. Walt looked up in confusion. "For me?" he asked, his voice cracking like old vinyl. "Everyone deserves a candle on their birthday," she replied. He didn't smile, not right away, just stared at the tiny flame with wet, bewildered eyes. Then, just as he leaned forward to blow it out, the dugout door banged open. Brad Connors, the stadium operations manager, stood there, face twisted with disgust. "What the hell is this?" he barked, striding toward them. "Are you using company food to throw birthday parties for the janitor now?" Elena stood up fast. "Janitor, he's not just a janitor, he's a veteran. And that food was going to be thrown out." Brad didn't care. He snatched the cake off the bench and slammed it into the trash can. "You're done. Fired. Clean out your locker." The candle sputtered out in the rain, one tiny flame snuffed out. One small kindness treated like a crime. The morning after the incident, Elena Torres sat in her one-bedroom apartment with a mug of cold coffee and a dozen missed calls from unknown numbers. She hadn't told anyone what happened, not her roommate, not her classmates, but the internet had. By sunrise, the footage captured by a young stadium janitor had exploded across social media. The headline blared, "Concession worker fired for feeding elderly groundskeeper on his birthday." The video showed everything. The cake, the candle, the confrontation, and her stunned expression as the operations manager slammed down the hammer of policy. At first, Elena felt sick, overwhelmed by the avalanche of messages and news anchors asking for interviews. But then something unexpected happened. Beneath the chaos, the comments sections began to shift. Not just outrage, but stories. Dozens of local veterans recognized Walt. "That's Kinney," one post read. "Served with him in 71, quiet guy, saved 3 men in a field hospital ambush, never talked about it." Others chimed in with similar praise. "Fixed my kid's bike for free, never asked for a dime. He kept the neighborhood clean when the city wouldn't." Walt Kinney, it seemed, had spent a lifetime doing the right thing, quietly, in the corners, where nobody bothered to look. The story spread. A local veterans organization posted a photo of Walt from 30 years ago, clean-shaven, younger but with the same sharp eyes, and launched a support fund in his name. That same day, someone left a fresh cupcake on the stadium steps with a note, "Happy birthday, Mr. Kinney. We see you now." Elena watched all of it unfold with a mixture of disbelief and guilt. She hadn't done any of this for attention. She just saw a lonely man and did what felt right. But now, people were showing up with signs, leaving flowers at the stadium gate, demanding answers. From Hartman Field's management. When a former minor league coach tweeted that Walt once stayed late in the rain to help clean out his flooded locker room, the story took on a new dimension, not just about a cake, but about a man the system had used and forgotten. And still, Walt hadn't spoken a word publicly. No interviews, no statement, no comment. He remained a ghost in the story built around him. But for the first time in years, the city was starting to see him, not as a vagrant, not as an invisible worker, but as something rare and precious, a quiet hero who had never once asked for applause. Miles Hartman sat in his office on the 40th floor of the Hartman building, half listening to a team of PR consultants chattering through a Zoom call about controlling the narrative. His eyes weren't on them. They were locked on the paused video on his phone. Frame by frame, he studied the man in the grainy footage. Soaked in rain, shoulders squared with quiet pride, refusing to let anyone defend him, a crumpled birthday cake at his feet. And then he saw it, the eyes. Blue, piercing, worn but steady. He knew those eyes. 5 years ago, Miles and his 8-year-old son had been visiting the stadium during a preseason charity event when a rusted light rig came loose from the catwalk. In a blur, a man had lunged forward, shoving Miles' son out of the way just before the steel crashed to the ground. The man took the brunt of it, shoulders shattered, ribs crushed, and before the medics arrived, he'd simply vanished. No name, no thanks, just one blurry photo from a security cam and a child's drawing of the man who saved me. Miles had hired investigators. He'd posted notices in hospitals, even quietly searched shelters. But after months of silence, even his closest advisors told him to let it go. And he had, outwardly at least. But now, watching the video again, it all came rushing back. This wasn't just some stadium scandal. This wasn't about policy. This was the man who saved his child. The weight of it hit Miles like a freight train. For years, he'd built a corporate empire, turned Hartman Field into a slick operation with branded nachos and loyalty apps. But in doing so, had he erased the soul of the place? Of course a man like Walt would slip through the cracks. He wasn't flashy. He didn't optimize. He worked. He served. And now, he was being discarded for the crime of being shown kindness. Miles closed his laptop and stood. He didn't need a press release. He didn't need a meeting. He needed to go down there himself, to look that man in the eye and say the words he should have said 5 years ago. Thank you. The sky had begun to clear by the time Miles Hartman stepped through the rear gate of Hartman Field, dressed not in his usual suit and tie, but in jeans, a plain jacket, and a ball cap pulled low. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The stadium, usually humming with vendors and fans, was silent, off-season hush echoing in every corridor. The few employees still working barely noticed the tall, silver-haired man making his way down the tunnel toward the field. As he emerged from the shadows, he saw it again, the dugout. Empty now, except for a half-swept pile of leaves and a battered rake leaning against the wall. No candle, no cake, no Walt. But the space still carried the weight of what had happened. This was the place, the same spot where his son had once nearly died, the same bench where an old man had sat alone on his birthday and quietly thanked a stranger for remembering him. Miles made his way through the corridors, noting the changes he once demanded: touchless soda dispensers, cost-tracking software, motion sensor lights. Everything is efficient. Everything is cold. As he passed by the break room, he spotted the young janitor who had posted the video. The kid looked up, startled, recognizing him immediately. "Sir?" Mr. Hartman? Miles simply nodded. You still have the security footage from the past week? He asked. Within minutes, they were in the back office, watching silent, grainy clips. It didn't take long. On screen, Walt appeared again, unloading crates, adjusting netting, brushing off dugout seats. Quiet, focused, unnoticed. Then came the scene, Elena placing the cake, Walt's stunned expression, and Brad Connor's furious arrival. No audio. But the truth didn't need sound. Miles leaned in, freezing the frame on Walt's profile. The same posture, the same steady expression, the unmistakable blue eyes. "It's him," he whispered. The janitor looked confused. "You know him?" Miles didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned, eyes scanning the stadium through the office window. It wasn't just about identity anymore. It was about what this place had become. Walt had been right here all along, serving the stadium, protecting its legacy, while the organization that bore Miles's name had nearly erased everything it stood for. It was time to change that. No more silence. No more policy over people. He straightened up and handed the janitor a slip of paper. "Call Brad, tell him I'll be here tomorrow morning, and make sure that the groundskeeper knows he's not invisible anymore." The next morning, the media vans were already parked outside Hartman Field when Miles Hartman arrived. Not by design, but by inevitability. Word had spread fast that the stadium's owner was making an unannounced appearance. A few dozen protesters stood quietly by the main gates, holding handmade signs. Kindness shouldn't cost a job. Justice for Elena. Dignity for Walt. Inside, the staff had gathered by the dugout, murmuring nervously. Brad Connors, the stadium's operations manager, paced near the tunnel, pale and sweating. He hadn't expected the boss to show up, let alone walk across the field, flanked by reporters and cameras. Miles didn't waste time. He stepped up to the home plate podium, used for opening day ceremonies, and nodded at the cluster of staff, vendors, and maintenance workers nearby. "Before we get started," he said, voice steady, "I want to speak not as a CEO, but as the father of a boy who wouldn't be alive today if not for a man this stadium forgot." A hush fell over the space. Miles looked directly at Brad. 5 years ago, during a preseason event, a faulty lighting rig collapsed. My son was in its path. He was saved by a stranger, a man who vanished before we could even say thank you. He raised a hand, revealing a printout of the viral video still, Walt's profile illuminated by the candlelight of a ruined birthday cake. "That man," Miles said slowly, "was Walt Kinney. He's worked on this field, quietly and without praise, for years. Yesterday, he was humiliated for being shown kindness. And that ends now." He turned back to the staff. "Effective immediately, Brad Connors is relieved of his duties as operations manager." Gasps echoed around the stadium. Brad tried to speak, stammering something about policy, rules, inventory control. Miles cut him off. "Policies are tools, not shields for cruelty." Then he turned to the crowd. "Elena Torres is reinstated to her position with full back pay and offered a new role, head of community engagement, because compassion is not just allowed in this organization, it's expected." He wasn't done. "Starting today, we're launching the Kinney Initiative, free meals for veterans at every home game, a housing fund for stadium employees in crisis, and a permanent role for Mr. Kinney, if he'll accept it." The crowd applauded. Some cried. Elena stood frozen, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, Miles felt something stir in the stadium air, a sense that dignity had finally stepped up to the plate. Walt Kinney hadn't returned to the stadium that morning for attention. Truth be told, he hadn't even known about the press or the crowd until he stepped off the bus and saw them all gathered near the gates. He'd almost turned back, but something in him, a quiet tug he couldn't explain, pulled him forward. Now, hours later, he sat in a folding chair near the bullpen, flannel sleeves rolled up, dirt still under his nails from a morning spent trimming the outfield edges. That's when Miles Hartman appeared, walking slowly across the gravel with something clutched in his hand. He stopped a few feet away, then crouched to eye level. "I've been looking for you," Miles said quietly. Walt squinted up, the early sun catching the silver in both their hair. "Why?" he asked, voice dry as rust. Miles opened his hand and revealed a worn piece of paper encased in plastic. A child's drawing. A stick figure in a green jacket, arms outstretched, pushing a smaller figure out of the path of a jagged object, labeled light. "My son drew this 5 years ago," Miles said. "You saved his life." Walt stared at the drawing for a long moment before exhaling. "Didn't think he remembered," he said, barely above a whisper. "Didn't want to make a fuss." "You didn't," Miles said, his voice thickening. "But I should have. You disappeared. I thought you died." Walt chuckled softly. "Nah, just broke a few things, got patched up, didn't want to meddle. Just needed to keep moving." Miles sat down beside him on the bench, the two men now shoulder to shoulder, neither saying anything for a beat. "We're offering you a job. A real one. Title, salary, benefits, not just maintenance. I want you to be our stadium historian and veterans liaison." Walt blinked. "What would I even do?" "Tell the stories no one's written down," Miles said, "and make sure no one like you ever gets overlooked again." Walt looked out across the field he'd quietly tended for years. For the first time, it felt like someone finally saw it through his eyes, not as turf and lines, but as memory, as pride, and home. "All right," he said softly. "Guess it's time I stayed in one place for a while." Opening day arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that made Hartman Field feel like the center of the world. The stands buzzed with early fans, families in team colors, and a new energy that hadn't been felt in years. But before the first pitch, before the anthem, before the players even took the field, the stadium PA crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, "today we honor someone who's been part of this stadium far longer than most of us knew. A man who's kept these grounds steady and whose quiet courage saved a life." On the Jumbotron, the grainy footage of Walt Kinney flickered to life, not the viral clip, but a new tribute. Photos of Walt maintaining the field, helping kids with their gloves, standing alone in the rain. As the crowd quieted, Elena stepped onto the field carrying a cake, this one perfectly round, topped with a single glowing candle. He walked it across the infield and stopped just outside the dugout where Walt stood waiting, freshly shaven, uniform crisp, eyes wide behind his glasses. He tried to wave her off with a bashful smile, but she shook her head and handed him the cake. "This time," she said softly, "everyone's here to remember." The stadium rose in a spontaneous standing ovation. Players, fans, vendors, even the grounds crew lining the outfield. Walt looked stunned, the candlelight flickering against his weathered face. Elena leaned closer. "Make your wish, Walt." He looked at her, then across the stadium to Miles Hartman, who stood with his arm around his teenage son. The same boy Walt had once saved. Then he looked back at the cake, eyes glistening. With a small breath, he blew out the candle. The crowd erupted in cheers, not for a home run, but for a man who had lived an entire life in the background, and now, finally, stood in the center of it all. For the first time, Walt raised a hand in acknowledgement, and the fans responded louder, a wave of appreciation for a quiet life that had finally been seen. Elena wiped a tear, laughing through it. "Told you it wasn't just a cake." Walt smiled back. "No," he said, voice low. "It was never about the cake. It was about being remembered." The days that followed opening day marked more than the start of a new season. They marked the beginning of something deeper at Hartman Field. The Kinney Initiative, announced just a week earlier, was already in motion. Veterans attending games now received free meals and reserved seats behind home plate. A newly unveiled bronze plaque in the main concourse read, "To those who serve quietly, we see you now." And at the center of it all, Walt Kinney, no longer just the groundskeeper, now served as the stadium's first veterans liaison and historian. Dressed in a crisp team-issued polo and khaki slacks, Walt made his rounds before every game, shaking hands with visiting servicemen, greeting families, and answering kids' questions about the field. For a man who had spent most of his life in the shadows, the spotlight took some getting used to. But there was a quiet pride in the way he carried himself now, like a man who finally had permission to stand tall. In a newly designated corner of the stadium known as the Kindness Wall, stories began to appear, handwritten notes from fans, workers, and community members recounting acts of unnoticed generosity. Some were about Walt, others about Elena, many were anonymous, but all of them told a bigger story. That dignity isn't earned through rank or wealth, but through small, decent actions repeated over time. Elena, now officially the head of community engagement, curated the wall with care. She also launched a podcast called Behind the Stands, where she interviewed ushers, janitors, popcorn vendors, and veterans who had once believed their stories didn't matter. One episode, featuring Walt recounting a childhood game played in a gravel lot with a taped-up bat, was downloaded over 200,000 times in its first week. Listeners from across the country flooded the comments. "This man reminds me of my grandfather. Thank you for giving a voice to people like this." One afternoon, after a home win, Miles Hartman stood by the exit gate waiting for his 13-year-old son Owen, who had just finished a school tour of the stadium. When Owen returned, he wasn't alone. Walt walked beside him, holding a well-worn baseball in one hand and the boy's sketchbook in the other. "He's quite the artist," Walt said with a grin. Owen beamed. "He taught me how to draw infield lines with chalk," the boy added. Miles looked at Walt, this man who once saved his son's life and then slipped quietly into the backdrop, and felt something settle in his chest. Not just gratitude, something more permanent. Trust, respect, a bond that didn't need ceremony, just consistency. As the stadium lights flickered to life that evening and the national anthem began to play, Walt stood just behind the dugout, hand over heart. He wasn't in the game, but somehow he'd already won. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't invisible. He was part of the story. On a late summer evening, with the season winding down and golden light pouring over the bleachers, Hartman Field felt different. Not newer, not louder, but warmer, more grounded. There was a spirit in the air now, something that had been missing for years but had quietly returned. It wasn't because of a record win streak or a new scoreboard. It was because the stadium had remembered who it was built for. Not just fans, but people. And not just the ones in the spotlight, but those behind the scenes. The ones who swept the aisles, lined the fields, and kept showing up without ever asking to be seen. That night, before the final home game, the announcer's voice rang through the PA. "As part of our new tradition, we invite you to join us in a moment of silence to honor someone whose quiet kindness made a difference." The crowd stood, silence fell. No name was given, no biography read, just a long, reverent pause. In section 103, Walt Kinney sat beside Owen Hartman, the boy he once saved, now a teenager with a sketchbook in his lap and a pencil in his hand. Walt still wore his ground crew cap, but now with a lapel pin shaped like a home plate that read Kinney Initiative. On the other side of the aisle, Miles Hartman watched the two with quiet pride. The stadium had become more than a business again. It had become a family, a place where doing the right thing meant more than running the perfect play. Elena, now known around the park as Coach of Kindness, gave a wave from the press box before heading out to help a local youth league team set up for their first ever night game on the practice field. As the national anthem ended and players took their positions, a boy in the row behind Walt leaned forward. "Hey, mister," he whispered. "Are you the guy from the video? The one with the cake?" Walt turned, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That's me," he said. "But the cake was her idea." He nodded toward Elena in the distance. "I just got lucky enough to eat it." The boy grinned. "That's pretty cool." Walt chuckled, then returned his gaze to the field. The lights came up. The umpire called, "Play ball." And in that moment, amid the cheering, the popcorn, and the crack of a bat, there was no viral fame, no rank, no division, just people showing up, doing their part, and being seen. And for a stadium built on numbers and wins, it turned out that what really mattered was something harder to measure: decency, loyalty, and kindness, passed from one person to the next. That's what really wins the game. The story of Walt Kinney teaches us that true heroism often goes unnoticed, not because it lacks impact, but because it is quiet, humble, and selfless. In a world obsessed with numbers, policies, and appearances, we're reminded that the most meaningful acts, kindness, loyalty, and compassion, can't be measured on a spreadsheet. Walt didn't seek recognition when he saved a child's life or showed up to work every day with dignity despite being forgotten. But when one woman chose to see him, to honor him with a simple birthday cake, it triggered a ripple effect that changed an entire organization. The lesson is clear. Never underestimate the power of a small, sincere act of kindness. It can reveal truth, inspire justice, and restore humanity in places where it's been lost. Whether you're a CEO, a worker, or a fan in the stands, you have the power to notice the unnoticed, to lift someone with your words, your actions, or even a single candle on a rainy night. In the end, what truly defines a legacy isn't success or status, but the lives you touch along the way. And the courage to stand up for what's right, even when no one is looking.